Stage 1. Seed. Kane Russo sat in his house, the newspaper trembling in his hands as he glared at the photo of Tony 10 Lives. A Weasley smile split the scrawny bastard's face as he handed out Thanksgiving turkeys. The sea of people surrounding his van looked at him with a mixture of emotions: desperation, adoration, envy. He stood there, soaking it all in, the left arm of his grey suit hanging deflated, without an arm to fill it. Beneath, the caption read, "Local philanthropist Tony Mazzagatti comes to the rescue this Thanksgiving." Venomous bile built up in the back of Kane's throat. He hurled the newspaper against the wall, then took another swig of vodka and slumped back on the couch. His mum had been banging on the door for 5 minutes by the time Kane heard her. Groggy and with a splitting headache, he shambled to the door and opened it. She stood in a rain-slicked coat, a bag of groceries in one hand. He sighed and stepped aside to let her in. She scrunched her nose as she walked in and set the groceries on the kitchen counter. "I brought over some real food," she said, taking off her raincoat, "since anything not in a bottle seems alien to you." "Mum, why are you here?" She looked him over with piercing leaf green eyes that matched his own. Despite being in her late 50s, she'd only shown signs of her age over the last year. Several streaks of grey swept through her dark hair and her olive skin had lost its luster. Finally, she said, "I'm worried about you, Kane." He grunted. "Yeah? Well, don't be." She tottered, then noticed the newspaper in the corner and winced. "I guess you read today's paper." Kane didn't reply, though the embers of his earlier rage sparked to life. "You've got to work through it, Kane. You can't let him ruin the rest of your life." The embers exploded. "Work through it? That piece of filth is parading around the city like the hometown hero, and you're telling me to work through it? It's been over a year, and you're worse than ever. If you continue to let your grief consume you, there won't be anything left." Tears welled in his eyes. "I can't stop it. They're out there. He's out there, while my son rots in the ground. It won't end until they join him." She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again when no words came out. Her lips trembled, and she moved forward to hug him. Then they wept until their eyes ran dry. Stage 2. Sword. "Wake up," a voice hissed in his ear, and Kane's eyes fluttered open. "Good," the voice said in his other ear. Kane sat up in bed and snatched his Glock 19 out from under his pillow. He scanned the room, but the moonlight that slipped in from the slits in the shutters revealed no one. "Who said that?" Kane asked, his pistol fixed on the door. "A wandering soul," the voice said, and the back of his neck prickled at the sensation of icy breath. Kane jumped out of bed and flicked on the bedside lamp, but the room remained gloomy. "What do you want?" he called out in a quivering voice. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you want." "And that is?" "An answer to your incessant prayers." "How?" "Through a gift, of course," the voice said, and the shadows at the corner of the room writhed. Kane fired, but nothing happened. Then his heart tried to displace his Adam's apple as a hunched figure crawled out from the shadows. The cloak of darkness it wore hid its body and face, but squirmed as if many things lay trapped beneath. From its depths, an arm coated in red ooze emerged, gripping a sword of glass. Kane spammed the trigger, but nothing left the barrel. The figure didn't register the attempt and held out the blade, hilt first. After a long moment, Kane walked forward, gun still trained on the creature. When it made no sudden moves, he eased the sword from its grip. The weapon was weightless, yet more solid than a steel rod. Then he screamed as transparent spindles of the glassy material erupted from the hilt and buried themselves in the back of his hand. Arterial blood pumped into the blade, followed by a tar-like smoke. Images of his son's dull eyes and bullet-riddled body played in his mind like a slideshow from hell. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the figure's face, warped, ivory, and eyeless. But that face was a mask. Beneath lurked another, one with an impossibly wide, wolfish grin and a long, crimson tongue. 3 days later, Kane bumped into Andrea Enzo and he realized none of it had been a dream. The renowned getaway driver was on a stroll through Central Park when Kane spotted him. The frigid air that had racked his body with shivers was a distant memory as he tailed the leather-clad man. In fact, molten lead boiled beneath the skin of his right arm, intensifying as he drew closer. "Hey, Andrea," Kane called out as they reached an unlit section of the gravel path. "Huh?" Andrea said as he turned around. Confusion switched to recognition, then fear as he went for his gun. It was too late. Feral instinct overrode Kane's senses, and he raised his arm. From it, a scarlet blade wreathed in smoke sprang out and sliced through the air. It lodged itself in Andrea's skull, and his gun clattered to the ground. After the shock wore off, Kane walked over to the body. The blade dissolved into a tendril of smoke and snaked back into his arm. Kane blinked. Andrea lay still, his pinched features showing no signs of life, yet his face was unblemished. He resisted the urge to spit on the corpse and walked back home, lips twisted in a smile for the first time in over a year. Stage 3. Sabretooth. Vincent DeLuca slapped Kane awake. He was in an empty room with no windows, tied to a chair and a dirty rag stuffed in his mouth. The back of his head throbbed as if an imp was trying to bludgeon its way out. 3 men stood behind Vincent, their faces stoic as they watched him. "You thought you'd get away with it, huh?" Vincent said, taking a cigarette out of his pocket. His greasy hair had receded halfway up his head since the last time Kane had seen him, though he still had the stupid pencil moustache. One of his goons lit the cigarette. Kane squirmed in the chair, but the ropes and the zip ties were too tight. There was no point in summoning the weapon since he couldn't use it in this position. He scowled at Vincent and mumbled through the gag. "What'd you say?" Vincent asked and ripped the gag free. "I said you shouldn't smoke in here. The room has no ventilation." Vincent chuckled and turned to grin at the others. Then he smacked Kane so hard he nearly toppled from the chair. "We know what you did, bozo." Kane shook his head to clear it, his left ear ringing. "Don't know what you're talking about." Andrea, Marco, Stefano. All of them dropped dead in the last 2 weeks. All of them involved in that little accident that happened a year ago. A ball of flame swelled in his chest. "Accident?" he seethed. "You call 27 bullets in my son an accident? They weren't there for your son, you clown." The blazing heat flooded into his right hand once again. "That's a shame, 'cause I sure as hell was there for them." Vincent smiled, and Kane braced for another smack, but it never came. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a Ruger. "Thanks, Russo. You just made my life a whole lot easier. All the boss wanted was a confession." Kane's heart thundered in his ears. There was no way he could cut himself free, let alone do it before Vincent gave him an explosive lobotomy. Then the eyes of his son stared at him, and something from deep within stirred, something that resided at the core of the inferno. "Feed me," it hissed in his head. "Feed me, feed me, feed me." Kane's mind flashed back to the weapon's birth, and he understood what he must do. He shifted his hands so that his right hand clasped his left wrist, then summoned the sword. A scream tore free from his lips as his left hand thudded to the floor. "What is that?" Vincent said, peering down. His eyes widened. "Where? How did you get a sword?" His words cut off as a vortex of black smoke exploded into the room. Kane squeezed his eyes shut. When the turbulence eased, he pried them open. Vincent and his lackeys were huddled against the left wall, eyes ready to pop from their sockets. Between them and the door sat a saber-toothed tiger made of swirling blood, smoke, and bone. Its 8-inch canines gleamed a brilliant white, while its eyes burned a furious red. He stared at the beast in awe, then turned his attention back to the men. "Feed," he said, and they all screamed. Stage 4. Swarm. Kane walked into the bar and found his last 2 targets. The triggerman, Mario Conti, and his boss, Tony 10 Lives. They sat at the bar, Mario alone on the left-hand side while Tony was on the right arguing with another man. Kane didn't have a plan. He didn't need one. Tracking them had been the hard part. The beast would handle the rest. All there was left to do was watch the certainty of death enter their eyes and the flicker of life leave. "Heard you were looking for me," Kane shouted. Mario spun around first, gun in his hand. Kane whirled to face him and summoned the saber-tooth. A chorus of shrieks surged through the bar. The way the fury on Mario's face morphed into sheer terror was priceless. He fired 3 shots, but the beast, who'd grown to the size of a small grizzly over the last 2 weeks, didn't even flinch. It pounced and clamped its jaws around Mario's neck. With a wet rip, it yanked off his head. Blood erupted from the headless corpse, showering Kane and his beast. The place reeked of iron. With a smile, he turned to face Tony, then froze. The words he was going to send him off with caught in his throat. Around Tony Mazzagatti swirled a silvery cloud of living daggers, hornets from the deepest pits of hell, with jaws like those of a bullet ant, and stingers as long as a toothpick. "That thing visited you too, huh?" Tony sneered. Kane gritted his teeth, then spoke. "Feed." The saber-tooth leapt at Tony, but it never reached him. Instead, the wall of silver hornets smashed into it mid-air, and it crashed to the floor, writhing. In seconds, their bites and stings reduced it down to the size of a bobcat. With no other choice, Kane ran out, Tony's howling laughter at his heels. The telephone rang, a cry that made his heart clench as it echoed in the silence of the empty house. Damn it, it was in the living room. Kane gritted his teeth and tried to stand, using a chair as support. He made it halfway up before his legs betrayed him, as tributaries of acid coursed through his nerves. 20 bites pockmarked his body, but the one sting in his left arm made him wish they'd finished him off. The phone continued to ring, so he crawled towards it. He made it to the living room entrance when it cut off and the voicemail played. "Can you please answer the phone, Kane? That's all I'm asking. I haven't seen you in ages, and every time I come over, no one answers the door. I don't know if it's because you're not home or because you don't want to see me, but..." The last word trailed off, and he thought the message had ended before his mum's voice picked back up again. I read the newspapers, saw what happened to those men who took Sam. It won't bring him back, Kane. It won't help you heal. Just stop before it's too late, for his sake, if not yours." The voicemail ended, for real this time. The lump in his throat grew with each minute he debated calling her back or not. He didn't want her to see him, not like this. But it would be good to hear her voice. His eyes stung and he blinked back tears. With several grunts, he made it to the last few feet to the telephone. Then he caught a glimpse of his son's framed photo next to it. His beautiful, dimpled smile on the day they'd gone to Central Park. The tears spilled over, and with them came the rage and the grief. They expanded within him like a volcanic plume of hot ash and dust. He had to release it. The heat returned to his right arm, and he unleashed it. Smoke, blood, and liquefied bone poured out. They whirled together, then solidified to form the saber-tooth. The beast, now much smaller, poured its back legs on the wood tiles, its glimmering ruby eyes set on him. Those eyes told him everything. But what could he offer this time? Then he remembered Tony. He took off his belt and bit down on it, squeezing his eyes shut while he yelled in his head. A loud crunch cut through the air as the beast's teeth carved through flesh and bone. Kane let out a muffled cry and opened his eyes in time to see his arm disappear down the creature's gullet. Smoke emanated from his blackened stump, and he realized it had been cauterized. Then the saber-tooth melted into a cloud of black, red, and white. It churned for a minute, then coalesced into 50 pus-filled sacks. The sacks burst open, and from them, bone-white wasps with black, faceted eyes and 2-inch red stingers flew out. Stage 5. Sapien. Kane opened the door and stepped into the office. In the hall behind him, the bodies of Tony's security lay, blood seeping from their wounds and foam gushing from their mouths. Eyes were missing from 3 of the corpses. Tony looked up from the papers on his desk and smirked. "I see you've committed yourself." Kane locked the door, then glowered down at him, his remaining fist clenching and unclenching. Tony rolled his eyes. "What? You think you're the only one to lose someone? I didn't lose him, you rat-faced bastard. You took him from me." "Relax. They weren't there for him, and you damn well know it. If you'd just done what I'd asked, none of this would have happened. I don't kill civilians. Does that help you sleep at night? Your rampage has taken a dozen lives so far. Well, rest assured that it stops at 13. Tony barked out a laugh. "You think you're gonna stop with me?" He grinned, exposing yellow, crooked teeth. "Your grief has eaten away at you, devoured the soft and weak parts, left the rest behind. You saying I should let bygones be bygones? "Oh, quite the contrary," Tony chuckled. Letting go would have been a disservice to his memory. You should embrace the pain. Let it mold you into something new, something better. In fact, you should thank me for giving you the opportunity to grow. Without it, you would have remained a mindless grunt. Something snapped within Kane's mind, and his vision turned crimson. "I'll embrace something, alright," he said and lunged at Tony. Tony's eyes narrowed, and Kane realized too late it had been a trap. A silver storm flooded out from his stump and hit Kane square in the chest. He slammed into the far wall and slid down, vision blurring. The swarm of demonic hornets buzzed over him as Tony stood up from behind his desk and approached. "Say hi to your son for me," Tony said, and swept his hand down like a guillotine. The swarm dove towards Kane, but at the last moment, a blizzard of wasps burst out from his own stump. The two clouds of malevolence clashed. Tony made a run for the door, and the tornado of acid and flame within him became a hurricane. With a yell, he charged through the two swarms and seized the boss. Pain ravaged his body from the bombardment of bites and stings, but he ignored it. His hand found Tony's neck, and the man's eyes bulged. He let his swarm dissipate, then resummoned it a second later, straight into Tony's face. The litany of screams that followed became gurgles as the swarm punched through his eyes, ears, and mouth. He ceased twitching, and his swarm dissolved. Kane crumpled to the floor, and his legs spasmed as the venom of the stings pumped through his blood. The thuds of running men came from behind the door. He would be dead soon, one way or another. Yet that didn't matter. What stunned him was that the pit in his stomach, from which the fire and acid churned out, hadn't closed, hadn't even shallowed or narrowed. The memories of him carrying his son's bullet-riddled corpse out of the car were as fresh as ever. The truth was that if he hadn't driven him to school that day, he would still be here, still smiling that sweet smile of his. The last flickering thoughts in his head danced around Tony's words. Embrace the pain. Kane let out a shuddering breath. The scumbag had been right. It was a part of him now, a part that wouldn't let go. All he had to do was return the favor, consummate the bond. "Feed," he whispered, and watched his swarm descend upon him. Kane woke with 8 armed men standing over him. They were shouting and pointing at something. He sat up and all their eyes flicked to him. 2 of them yelled, then they all pointed their guns at his head. "You the asshole that got the boss?" one of them asked, cocking the hammer of his revolver. Kane rose, and one of the men grabbed him from behind. A forest of white spear-like thorns shot out from his body. Then they retracted, and all the men collapsed like puppets whose strings had been cut. Foam spewed from their mouths and mixed with the blood from their wounds. He stepped over them and walked out. He found his mother sitting at his doorstep when he got home. Her face dropped and became ashen as she glanced up at him. Without speaking, he opened the door and pushed past her into the house. "What were you thinking?" her voice called out from behind him. She strode into the kitchen, eyes streaming with tears. "Do you realize what you've done?" "Careful," he growled. "Careful? You've thrown your life away over petty revenge, and you're telling me to be careful? If the police don't get you, they will. I did what needed to be done." She tore at her hair. "What needed to be done was for you to process it and move on. That wasn't an option. I was his father, and I was his grandmother. I loved that boy just as much as you did. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't think of him." "It isn't the same," he said, and turned his back to her. She grabbed his wrist, and his body reacted. Spikes sprang out, impaling her hand in 3 places. She shrieked and fell back. Cain darted forward and knelt beside her as she thrashed. Foam spurted from her mouth and spittle struck his cheek. A few seconds later, she was gone. Cain stared unbelieving for what seemed like an hour. Then he let out a throat-wrenching scream.